Good morning, friends. Welcome to Sutta Study with Bhante Sudaso. Good morning to Geeta, Elaine, Michael. Good to see you. Jessica, hello. Jens, Sarah, and Edward. Welcome all, friends, and welcome to also all our other friends who are watching. But I only see a little number on the top of the screen. All right. And of course, good morning to Bhante Sudaso. Thank you so much for sharing with us the teachings of the Buddha. So this morning we will be studying with Bhante the Salla Sutta, the Thorn, Samyutta Nikaya 36.6. And you can find the link on the live chat, and that is Bhante Sudaso's translation. So he will be reading from that sutta, and you can follow along if you wish to do so. And hello to Galaxy, Lilia, and Erin. Welcome, friends. All right, so without further ado, I'll pass it on to Bhante so we can start studying.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Well, good morning, friends. And welcome to another Sutta study session. As mentioned, today we'll be looking at the Salla Sutta, so Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 36, Sutta number 6, translated here as the Thorn. So as usual, I'll read through the sutta and periodically give some explanations, and at the end we'll have some discussion. This is a relatively short sutta, but one with a very important message. And it's a sutta which is relatively well known, so you might recognize this sutta. So the sutta begins. The Buddha says, "Monks, the uneducated commoner feels pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, and neutral feelings. Monks, an educated disciple of the noble ones, also feels pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, and neutral feelings. Monks, in this case, what is the difference? What is the distinction? What is the variance between an educated disciple of the noble ones and an uneducated commoner?" So it starts with the Buddha asking a question of the monks, which I find kind of amusing. But this is something that we see a few times in the suttas, where rather than the Buddha giving a teaching out of nowhere, he would ask a question. And depending upon how people replied, then that would shape the teaching that he gave. So this also indicates the adaptive and responsive nature of the Buddha's teachings. So the Buddha was always feeling out where his audience was, what they needed to hear, what was most relevant to them. A little bit about the language being used here. So the phrase translated here as the uneducated commoner, in Pali, that's asuttava patujana. So asuttava literally means one who has not heard. So sutta means heard. Suttava means one who has a store of information, one who has heard a lot, one who possesses a stockpile of information that they've heard. So an asuttava is somebody who has not heard a lot, who does not have a stockpile of information. And patujana is made of two parts. The first part, puttu, means common or widespread, and jana means populace, people. So patujana is the common people. So asuttava patujana then is your uneducated common people. The ordinary people of the world who don't know much about Buddhism, who don't know much about the Dhamma. Just as I don't know much about microphones, apparently. Okay. And the other word that's translated here is educated disciple of the noble ones. In Pali, that's Suttava Arya Savaka. So Suttava, as I mentioned earlier, means one who has heard a lot, who has a stockpile of information. Arya Savaka is made up of two parts. Arya means noble, and Savaka means disciple. Savaka literally means a listener. So Arya Savaka can mean one who listens to the noble ones, one who is a disciple of those who are noble. And noble one means someone who has attained some stage of awakening, someone who has attained at least the first stage of enlightenment. So Arya Savaka then is a disciple of enlightened beings, somebody who follows the teachings of enlightened beings. So the basic question that's being asked here is, what's the difference between someone who is not Buddhist or perhaps has only a very limited amount of knowledge and practice of Buddhism versus somebody who understands Buddhism well and is committed to practicing it? What's the difference between these two? Because both of them experience pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feeling. So what's the difference between how a non-Buddhist practitioner or somebody new on the path relates to pleasure, pain, and neutral feeling versus how advanced practitioner relates to pleasant, painful, and neutral feeling? And the monks replied, Bhante, our teachings are rooted in the Blessed One, guided by the Blessed One, based on the Blessed One. Bhante, it would be wonderful if the Blessed One would elucidate the meaning of this statement. Having heard it from the Blessed One, the monks will remember it. In other words, the monks are like, why don't you tell us? They're like, you're the teacher, you're the Buddha, why don't you tell us? And the Buddha says, therefore, monks, listen and carefully pay attention. I will speak. Yes, Bhante, those monks replied to the Blessed One. The Blessed One said this, monks, when an uneducated commoner is touched by a painful sensation, he sorrows, frets, and laments, beating his chest and wailing, and becomes confused. He feels two feelings, one physical and one mental. Monks, it is just like a person who has been pierced by a thorn. Then he is pierced again by a second thorn. Monks, in this way, the person feels the feeling of two thorns. So when I read this passage, I immediately thought of our rose bushes out by the kitchen entrance to the monastery. Bhante Sumino was laughing because he was recently pierced by the thorns of the rose bushes. So it's like you go into maybe cut some roses for the altar or maybe to trim back the bush, and you're not being careful and you jab yourself with one thorn. And then you freak out and you're like, ah! And then in flailing back, then you slam your arm into another thorn. So that confused flailing about means that we wind up causing ourselves twice as much pain. So that's exactly the point the Buddha is making here. We get some kind of painful sensation. In this example, you accidentally pierce yourself with a thorn. And then we respond with hostility towards the experience. We respond with despair. We respond with anguish. We respond with whining and complaining. We try to avoid and escape the experience. So that's all flailing about. And that flailing about just causes us more pain. It causes us mental and emotional pain on top of the physical pain. So again, the Buddha goes on. He says, monks, in the same way, when an uneducated commoner is touched by a painful sensation, he sorrows, frets, and laments, beating his chest and wailing, and becomes confused. He feels two feelings, physical and mental. When touched by that painful feeling, he is aversive. Since he is aversive towards that painful feeling, the tendency of aversion towards painful feelings is latent in him. So what he's pointing to here is that when we experience a painful sensation, if we don't understand the Dhamma, if we have not been practicing the Dhamma well, then we will fall immediately into aversion. Because the tendency of the mind, the habit of the mind, is to be aversive towards painful feelings, which is quite natural. So for example, this morning there was cilantro on the breakfast table. So for me, that's a very painful feeling, the smell of cilantro, very painful sensation. And so the tendency of aversion came up very strongly. I probably should have read the sutta before breakfast. That would have helped quite a bit. So I had the first thorn, which was the smell of cilantro. And I followed it up immediately by stabbing myself with the second thorn, which is aversion towards the smell of cilantro. Not so smart. Apparently, I'm an uneducated commoner. But I'm working on it. So the tendency of aversion towards painful feelings is latent in him. So that's indicating then that the mind is still dominated by this unwholesome habit of hating things. So one of the three basic fires that burn the mind. Then the Buddha goes on. He says, when touched by painful feelings, he seeks delight in sensual pleasure. Why is that? Monks, an uneducated commoner does not know any escape from painful feelings other than sensual pleasure. Does this sound familiar? Since he seeks delight in sensual pleasure, the tendency of passion towards pleasant feelings is latent in him. So we start feeling a little depressed and downhearted, so we go and we get some chocolate. Or we're feeling bored, disaffected, so we turn on the TV. Or we're disappointed with something our friends did, so we go and we watch YouTube, and not Dhamma YouTube, but just like the usual random pop culture crap kind of YouTube. So what do we do? When we're overcome by painful feelings, we're sinking into aversion and negativity and hostility towards painful feelings. We're falling into despair and depression. What do? We try to distract ourselves by indulging in pleasant things. We try to turn our mind away from the unpleasant experience by immersing our mind in pleasant things, enjoyable things. And why do we do that? Well, the Buddha says, first off, because we don't know anything else. We don't recognize that there's an escape from painful feeling, which doesn't involve indulging in sensuality. So we don't recognize that if we transform our mind, if we purify our mind, then the discomfort will immediately disappear without needing anything else. So instead, we seek for a pleasant distraction to pull our mind away from the unpleasantness that we're facing, the unpleasantness that we've inflicted on ourselves. And the second reason why we seek out sensual pleasure when we're having a hard time is because of our underlying tendency of passion, of lust, of craving. So the word translated here as passion in Pali is raga. So raga, it's often translated as lust. So lust, this really strong burning desire for something, usually something pleasant. It also has the meaning of passion, but passion needs to be understood in this context of this burning desire, this intense lusting for pleasant experience. So then whenever we're in compromising situations, then that underlying habit of lust and passion tends to come up very strongly, dominates the mind very quickly and easily if we don't pay close attention. So if we're paying close attention, then we can catch it in its early stages and recognize it for what it is. We can recognize its destructive nature, its poisonous nature. We can recognize its agitating and uncomfortable nature. We can see that passionate craving arising in the mind and be like, oh, I know what that is. That's a whole load of dukkha. That's all it is. It's just suffering arising. And if I get on board, then I'm just getting on board suffering. If I play along, I'm just playing along with suffering. Why would I do that to myself? Better not to do that to myself. But here we're talking about the uneducated commoner, which doesn't know anything else, doesn't know any other way of escaping unpleasantness than through flinging themselves recklessly into pleasantness. So when the lust for pleasant feeling arises, they usually just run with it, because why not? When one doesn't understand the Dhamma, it's also hard to understand why one wouldn't indulge in sensual pleasure, why one wouldn't fling oneself headlong into the pursuit of pleasant experiences. Because it's difficult to see the drawbacks. It's difficult to see the disadvantages of obsession with sensuality, which is why the Buddha put so much emphasis on seeing the drawbacks of sensuality, the drawbacks of attachment, the drawbacks of desire. That's why the Buddha put so much emphasis on practicing renunciation, contentment, and letting go, because this is where we get stuck so easily. It's really hard to see what's wrong with having a little bit of chocolate when you're feeling down. What's the big deal? Well, technically, there's nothing wrong with it, but we're fueling our delusion that that's the right way to deal with feeling down. We're fueling our deep-set misunderstanding that our belief that the way to evade unpleasant experiences is through trying to cover it up or replace it with something pleasant. Which means that ultimately we're not addressing either our tendency towards aversion or our tendency towards desire, which means our mind will just keep getting dragged around by these things. Our mind will never settle into peacefulness and clarity. It will just keep getting dragged around by desire and aversion, aversion and desire, desire and aversion. So it's really important to cultivate that recognition. That recognition of the harmfulness of aversion and the harmfulness of desire. To recognize the drawbacks of unwholesome mind states and the blessings of serenity, of a peaceful mind. And so the Buddha continues. He does not accurately understand the origin, disappearance, appeal, drawback, and escape regarding those feelings. So as I was just saying, so we don't understand the drawback. So the Buddha is emphasizing here to see the origin and the disappearance. So noticing how pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feelings, noticing how they come into being and then disappear. So he's talking about the perception of impermanence, recognizing the impermanent, ephemeral nature of all phenomena, the insubstantial nature of feeling. So normally when a painful feeling arises, we take it as permanent, as stable, as solid, as real. And we're like, oh, this hurts so much. I hate this. Well, just wait a moment and it changes. In fact, you don't even have to wait a moment. It's already changing. In fact, the sensation that we're lamenting has already ended. This is the deep irony. We feel some pain and then we think, I hate this. But the this that we're hating is already over. That was just a brief momentary experience, which is already gone. There's something else happening now. It might resemble what happened a moment ago, but it's something different. So recognizing the arising and ceasing of feeling, one, it becomes fascinating, watching how every single moment our entire experience flashes into existence and immediately flashes out of existence. Every single moment. So one, that's fascinating. And when the mind is fascinated, it's not aversive. But two, we recognize that there's nothing persistent and solid that we can be aversive towards or lustful towards in the first place. So cultivating the perception of impermanence naturally leads to equanimity and contentment. So that's one set, origin and disappearance. And the other is the set of three. So the appeal, the drawback, and the escape. So the appeal is recognizing the what is it that draws us in. So why are we so obsessed with pleasant feelings? Because it feels good. It's nice. It's enjoyable. There's no denying it. Or what's the appeal in aversion? This is a little more subtle because there's this sickly pleasure in aversion. So aversion feels toxic and yet we like it. So really investigate that. So the appeal of pleasure is quite clear. There's really no denying it. But what's the appeal of aversion? Dig into that. Really look closely at that. Why are we so obsessed with this toxic mind state? It's painful when it's present. Aversion is not a fun experience. What's the appeal? Really dig into this. And second, noticing the drawback. So the drawback of pleasant sensations is that they're temporary. They're unreliable. We can't get them when we want them. They come and they go. They're unstable. So because they're unstable and unreliable, then desire and attachment related to that which is unstable and unreliable will inevitably produce disappointment. So that's the drawback. It's like building your house on sand or building your house on a swamp. It seems like a good idea at first, but within a very short period of time, things start collapsing. Turns out to not be such a great idea after all. And the escape. So the escape, it's not mentioned in the sutta, I don't think. But the escape the Buddha defines elsewhere as being to cultivate disenchantment and dispassion towards those feelings. So disenchantment means seeing it for what it is, not seeking pleasure in what's pleasant, not rejecting what's unpleasant, and maintaining full awareness, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And dispassion, so not getting obsessed with whatever arises. So when the mind has disenchantment and dispassion, then we're not caught in desire and aversion, and we're not subject to delusion. So this is the understanding of the appeal, the drawback, and the escape, which appears in many suttas as being a very concise description of Buddhist practice. So the Buddha continues, since he does not accurately understand the origin, disappearance, appeal, drawback, and escape regarding those feelings, the tendency of ignorance towards neutral feelings is latent in him. In other words, we are very much interested in painful sensations, and we're very much interested in pleasant sensations, but we generally don't care the slightest bit whatsoever about things which are neither painful nor pleasant. So we don't pay any attention to them. We're not interested in them. We don't cultivate any understanding of them. We're just trying to run away from the painful and pursue the pleasant. And this is quite a problem because much of Buddhist practice actually involves working with neutral sensation, neutral feeling, neutral mind states. Cultivating a clear understanding of neutral mind states. And actually the mind state of disenchantment is a neutral mind state. It's not pleasant, it's not painful. It's neutral. It's very peaceful, it's very serene. So we need to learn how to cultivate an appreciation for serenity of mind. Not for the excitement of pleasure, but for the peacefulness of a serene, undisturbed mind. Not for the sickly joy of hating things, but for the serene joy of equanimity. Then the Buddha continues. If he feels a pleasant feeling, he is trapped. If he feels a painful feeling, he is trapped. If he feels a neutral feeling, he is trapped. Kind of depressing, isn't it? Monks, this is called an uneducated commoner is trapped by birth, decay, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, depression, and anguish. He is trapped by dissatisfaction, I say. Suddenly, it's not all fun and games anymore. That whole run away from pain, pursue pleasure. It seems like freedom, but it's actually entrapment. Seems like we're free to do whatever we want, but actually we're just being driven around. We're just trapped by the tendencies of mind, trapped by the unexamined habits of mind, trapped by reactivity to that which is beyond our control. That's not freedom, it's entrapment. So then the Buddha gives the happy side of things. He says, monks, when an educated disciple of the noble ones is touched by a painful sensation, he does not sorrow, fret, lament, beat his chest, wail, or become confused. He feels one feeling, physical, not mental. Monks, it is just like a person who has been pierced by a thorn, but he is not pierced again by a second thorn. Monks, in this way, the person feels the feeling of only one thorn. So in this case, when you're pruning the rose bush and you accidentally pierce your hand on a thorn, then there's the recognition, oh, I just pierced my hand on a thorn. I need to be very careful in removing my hand so that I don't get caught on other thorns as well. So instead of like, there's just like, oh, that's not so good. Oh, it's starting to bleed. Oh, I better take care of this. So one calmly, peacefully removes one hand and takes care of the wound. There's not that knee-jerk reaction, that habitual reactivity of flailing around. There's simply a recognition of what's happening with serenity and clarity. So in this way, there's only the painful sensation, but not any kind of mental reactivity to that painful sensation. So the Buddha says, monks, in the same way, when an educated disciple of the noble ones is touched by a painful sensation, he does not sorrow, fret, lament, beat his chest, wail, or become confused. He feels one feeling, physical, not mental. When touched by that painful feeling, he is not aversive. Since he is not aversive towards that painful feeling, the tendency of aversion towards painful feelings is not latent in him. In other words, he's feeling the sensation, but he's not hating it. He's just recognizing it for what it is. There's not that like, oh, this is so awful. There's just, oh, no, this is what's happening. There's a thorn piercing my hand. That's life. Sometimes a thorn pierces your hand. What's the big deal? No problem. So then this is purifying the mind. It's weakening and breaking the habit of aversion, the underlying tendency towards aversion. And the Buddha continues, when touched by painful feelings, he does not seek delight and sensual pleasure. Why is that? Monks, an educated disciple of the noble ones knows an escape from painful feelings other than sensual pleasure. So in other words, an educated disciple of the noble ones understands Buddhist practice, understands how to practice equanimity, understands how to practice wisdom, understands that there's no value in trying to escape painful sensations by pursuing pleasant ones. The Buddha says, since he does not seek delight in sensual pleasure, the tendency of passion towards pleasant feelings is not latent in him. So once again, this is recognizing that every time we restrain ourselves from seeking out pleasant experiences, then the tendency of passion becomes weaker. The habit of craving pleasantness becomes weaker. And eventually we can break that habit entirely. And again, recognizing that craving is an unpleasant experience. It's a miserable experience. It's not a happy feeling at all. But we keep getting caught up in craving because we're fixated on the pleasantness of what we're trying to get. We're fixated on the belief that what we're trying to get will be worth it. But in so doing, we're completely missing out on all the pain that we're causing ourselves right in the present moment by indulging in that desire. So cultivating an awareness of the unpleasantness of craving itself. Cultivating an awareness of how uncomfortable it is to be lusting after something. And by contrast, how joyful it is to be equanimous. How blissful it is to be content. So the Buddha continues. He accurately understands the origin, disappearance, appeal, drawback, and escape regarding those feelings. Since he accurately understands the origin, disappearance, appeal, drawback, and escape regarding those feelings, the tendency of ignorance towards neutral feelings is not latent in him. It's interesting here that he directly connects the practice of recognizing origin, disappearance, appeal, drawback, and escape. He directly connects that with the tendency of ignorance towards neutral feelings. So to contemplate the nature of reality as it is, then appears to be classified as a neutral experience, neutral sensation, neutral feeling. And it's something which, in order to clearly see reality as it is, we need to be comfortable with neutral feeling, comfortable with not feeling either pleasant or painful feeling, comfortable with facing reality in all its sheer mind-numbing boredom. And there's another sutta where the Buddha says, neutral feeling is painful when it is not known and pleasant when it is known. And there's another sutta where the Buddha says that neutral feeling is actually a subtle kind of pleasant feeling. So neutral feeling might sound kind of boring, but actually when your mind is wisely discerning one's experience, then there's a subtle pleasure in that. It's not like the wild pleasure of drinking too much coffee and listening to music. All right, fill in your wild pleasure. I'm picking something relatively tame here. That's actually not wild at all. What am I talking about? But it's this subtle, peaceful pleasure, subtle, peaceful joy of clearly knowing one's experience without reacting blindly to it. So the Buddha continues, he says, if he feels a pleasant feeling, he is not trapped. If he feels a painful feeling, he is not trapped. If he feels a neutral feeling, he is not trapped. Monks, this is called, an educated disciple of the noble ones is not trapped by birth, decay, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, depression, and anguish. He is not trapped by dissatisfaction, I say. So this is emphasizing that when we're willing to directly face pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral with serenity and clarity, then we experience freedom of mind. And that freedom of mind persists no matter where we are or what's going on, because all we ever experience is pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral sensation. That's it. So if we can understand how to face pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral with wisdom, clarity, and unshakable contentment, then we'll always be okay no matter where we are or what we face. There's another sutta where the Buddha says, one who fully understands pleasant, painful, and neutral has nothing more to do. In other words, if one fully understands pleasant, painful, and neutral, that's enough to attain enlightenment. So then the Buddha wraps up. He says, monks, this is the difference, the distinction, the variance between an educated disciple of the noble ones and an uneducated commoner. And then he ends with some inspiring verses, as many of the suttas in the Samyutta Nikaya end. He says, the wise one who has learned much does not feel pleasure or pain. This is the great distinction between a steadfast, wholesome one and a commoner. When one has learned much of the recognized teachings, seeing clearly both this world and other worlds, then one's mind is not agitated by desirable things or aversive towards what is undesirable. For that one, both approval and rejection have been vaporized, have disappeared, and do not exist. Having known the path, flawless and sorrowless, one fully understands and transcends existence. So that's the end of this sutta. So lovely little sutta, which is, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's fairly well known, but it's always worth looking back at well-known suttas, as every time we reread a sutta, we find something more. We find some deeper layer to it. So it's always good to return to the suttas over and over and over again, especially as our practice develops and deepens. Then we read the suttas with fresh eyes, and we catch deeper layers of meaning to them, deeper layers of profundity. So at this time, if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and enter them in, and I'll answer them as best I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So we have lots of excitement for this beautiful sutta. And Mark is asking, so I have a friend who has to live with a parent whose behavior causes them no shortage of anger. And despite many attempts to talk to them where the parent agrees to change, the next day the same habitual behavior happens. Any suggestions, as they can't move out yet?
Yeah, recognize that their parent is crazy. That's the most important thing. So the problem here is not the parent's behavior. The problem is that the person is expecting their parent's behavior to be rational. That's the problem. That's it.
All right. And Michael said,
sometimes I give long answers, sometimes I give short answers.
That's right. Very accurate. And Michael says, it sounds as though trying to allay pain and suffering by filling myself with some kind of pleasure is a duality that never works. Mm-hmm. Observing the pain and suffering that comes up in me when I experience it as not belonging to me suggests a kind of unity without an opposite. So why, when pain is intense in my legs and back during meditation, do I sometimes revert to counting breaths as a way to get the mind off the pain? True confessions from Michael. Far to go, much to do.
Well, so one thing that I should say as far as pain and meditation is that when your samadhi is strong, you do not feel pain. And the reason for this is because when you're in samadhi, you're not indulging in desire and aversion. So actually reverting to breath counting, if you're doing it in order to strengthen your samadhi, that's okay. That's not a problem. I don't see anything wrong with that. Now, if you told me that you reverted to writing fantasy novels in your head in order to escape the pain, that would be a problem. Because that's not going to help your samadhi. And in fact, that's just going to keep fueling your desire and aversion. But coming back to a coarser meditation method in order to try to reestablish samadhi, that's fine. Because actually, when pain is coming up in meditation, that's an indication that our samadhi is weak. We often think, especially in the early stages of practice, we often think that pain is just an inevitability. That's not true. Pain is an indication that our samadhi is still weak. That's what it mainly means. So yeah, build up your samadhi. Count breaths if that's what works for you. And when your samadhi gets strong, then you drop the counting and just stay with the mindfulness and concentration. And when you are fully focused on your samadhi object, then you will not feel pain. Okay?
Great. Thank you, Bante. Mike also says, this is another sutta to come back to often and to contemplate. Yes, that is indeed true. And Gita says, Bante, does habit energy have something to do with this? In the Lankavatara Sutta Mahayana, likening or disliking things due to our habitual energy from the past. Need to retrain our mind reactions because teaches us to use wisdom in our reactions. Buddhism teaches us to use wisdom in our reactions.
Yeah, that sounds correct. One way I've heard it explained actually is that Buddhist practice is about replacing reaction with responsiveness. So we're shifting away from habitual reactivity towards wise responsiveness. Do you understand? Okay, anything else?
Great. And I think you already answered Ishan's question. That was, can you please explain, give examples a little more how neutral feeling can be a trap? I think you answered that during the talk.
Yeah.
And I think that's all in terms of the questions from our friends online. But I had a question. What is the translation in Pali? What is the word in Pali for what is translated as latent?
Let me look. So in Pali, it's a sentence with a verb. So nanuseti. So means it or that. Not anuseti. Anuseti literally means underlying. So anu means along with or together with, and seti literally means like lying down. So the anuseti is the verb form of the noun anusaya. So anusaya is commonly translated as underlying tendency or as habit. Here it's just translated as tendency. So anusaya I translate in the sutta as tendency. Sometimes translated latent tendency, similar meaning. So anuseti is something that a tendency that's latent in the mind. So here I simply translated it as so nanuseti, I translated as is not latent. But literally it means not underlying the mind, not present as an underlying tendency in the mind.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Bante.
Yeah.
Sadhu.
Anything else?
Mark just says, thanks for fixing the appearance of chats and replays of your talks. I'm not sure we did that. I think it's something automatic that Google does. But if you have in the future any recommendation or requests, please send an email to info@mpcloud.org. I'll write it down here. And we will do our best to figure it out, especially now that we have younger people at the monastery who seem to be a little bit more well-versed with technology. Perhaps we can actually fix things. All right. Well, I think that's all for this morning. And we'll see you all this evening for monk chat. So bring any questions you might have on Dhamma or on anything related to Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And we'll try our best to answer your questions. So we'll see you at 7:30 p.m. and we can end this morning with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.